All right. Hello again, Avengers, and welcome to another exciting daily vlog. This is daily vlog number 45, I think. So today, couple of updates. I did finally beat Final Fantasy 16. Loved it. Loved everything about it. I did the one DLC that's come out thus far. I got to do, and it was it wasn't like it was fun. It just felt, I don't know, a little bit underwhelming because effectively what it was a single dungeon that had something like four bosses, which like three of them were like reskinned, or maybe just two of them were reskinned uh, boss fights from other parts of the game, with a few kind of changes to them to make them a little bit unique, and then two of them were actually new monsters. And then a new sword and two new accessories, which or two new pieces of armor, which for the most part in Final Fantasy 16, swords are cool not only because they make you more powerful, but each one has a different model, and using there's a feature in it where you can actually change the visual model of whatever sword you have, so you can equip whichever one is the most powerful. But if you have one that just looks cooler, you can just use that one. So for me, I love all the different swords in the Giga game. Most of them look really cool. A few of them look dumb, but for the most part, they all look really cool. So I'm good with having a new sword model, and it was more powerful than anything in the base game, which was nice. And then after you beat the final boss, you can actually upgrade it into an even more powerful and super badass looking sword. So all those things, super cool, super into it. But it's a $10 DLC, and $10 just seems like a little bit much for a single dungeon with four boss battles. And the lore to it is, I mean, it's okay, but they really don't go into too much detail, and they could have done a lot more with it. There's one more DLC that's coming out. I think it's supposed to be this spring, so we'll see if maybe this first DLC kind of feeds into the other one or something. But overall, Final Fantasy 16 was amazing. It was super fun. I love the world that it was in. Gameplay in and of itself was relatively good. My one issue with it is combat starts getting a little bit repetitive once you've found the icons that are really your jam. Combat effectively turns into step 1, stagger the enemy; step 2, use the abilities that you're used to using; step 3, profit. And that's it. Like, it becomes very repetitive, even with the more complicated bosses. It's still okay, figure out their pattern, dodge, attack, break down their stagger gauge, stagger them, unleash damage, rinse, repeat. Final boss is really good. But up until that point, I was feeling a little bit stale. But beyond that, and again, it's relatively minor because the combat still feels good. It's just, I wish they had given you more variety in the things that you could do. Like, each icon gives you a special ability kind of built into the icon, and all of them were interesting, and I used every single one of them throughout the campaign. But you get that special ability, and then you also get a grand total of 4 like special attacks for each icon, but you can only ever have 2 equipped at any given time. And a lot of times the iconic abilities are very situational based, where there's just certain, like one of the first ones that you could get is this thing where you create this kind of wall of fire and you slam it into the ground, and if you happen to intercept a projectile with that slam, it fires off these 2, or eventually 4 if you upgrade it, waves of fire with sword slashes. And it's a really effective move. It destroys a crap ton of stagger gauge, and it also it also does a lot of damage, and again, it stops projectiles, which is really, really nice. However, there are a lot of bosses that just don't use projectiles, or the projectiles that they use are so quick or so random that it's not worth trying to deflect them with that. Or you'll use it and then it'll be on cooldown when you actually need it for some reason. So while it's a really, really good ability, and I used it for most of my playthrough, it's very situational. And there's a lot of times where the benefit of it you just never get to use. There's another one for an icon that I won't reveal. But this particular icon has an ability where if you dodge a melee attack with this ability, it basically becomes this really cool counter ability, which again, really great, but it again is highly situational. It's technically more useful than the projectile one, because not all bosses use projectiles, but all bosses and most enemies do use some form of melee attack at some point. But getting the timing down perfectly and everything like that just gets hectic. So I would have preferred them to give more abilities to each icons and allow you, because in order to use any of the abilities, you hold down the right trigger, and then square and triangle, which are normally your melee attack and ranged attack, turn into your 2 icon abilities. So of the 4 abilities that you have, you can only have 2 active at any given time. And I would have liked to see them, again, since you're pushing the you're pushing the R2 button already, why not give us 4 buttons that we can use, since there are 4 buttons, and while you have that thing down, you're actually not using the jump button or the iconic ability button, like they just don't work. So there really wasn't any reason to not give us 2 more buttons, other than the fact that they only gave you 4 iconic abilities, and it would effectively mean that if you could use all 4 of them at all times, then there would really be no choice. So I would have loved to see them just have more abilities for each icon and then give us 4 that we can choose from. But that was my only real criticism of it. The story's great. And then after doing that, after beating that, I went back to my Trials of Mana remake playthrough and went through that again, and dear God, is that game good. I love the Mana series. I have played, I think, almost every Mana game. I skipped out on 2. There was one for the DS that was technically a real-time strategy game. That was, lore-wise, is actually a direct sequel to Trials of Mana, before Trials of Mana was ever released in the US. It has some of the same characters and stuff in that. So that one I never played, but I eventually want to. And then there's a PS2 Mana game that was meant to be kind of the origin story of the Mana Tree and the Mana Knight and everything like that. And it was a 3D action RPG, and it sucked. Like, they just butchered everything, and it just wasn't a good game. And I've never played that. And then there was a few mobile games. Like, there was one mobile game that just never came out in the US, and I never got a chance to play it. And then there was a Mana series mobile game that I did play for a little bit. But it got canceled after like less than a year, which really upset me because it's actually a lot of fun. But yeah, I love the Mana series. The first game in the Mana series I ever played was Secret of Mana, and we used to rent it from Blockbuster every week until I think we finally purchased it at one point, and then I had to get rid of it. But that's another story. And then I think for a birthday or Christmas or something, my parents got me Final Fantasy Adventure, thinking it was a Final Fantasy game, because I was really into that, and it's not. It's actually the first of the Mana games, and I played that. It's a Game Boy game, and I played that over and over and over again. I loved it, and I didn't realize it was a Mana game. And then when I started getting into the kind of emulation scene and fan translations, I found Seiken Densetsu 3, which is now Trials of Mana, but it wasn't released in the US. And I believe Seiken Densetsu 3 was one of the first fan translations that got released. It was one of the pioneers of the fan translation kind of community, where fans of Japanese games would actually put forth the effort of creating translations and making it so people that don't speak Japanese could play these games. And so I got introduced to Seiken Densetsu 3, which I loved. It was amazing. Star Ocean, the first Star Ocean game, didn't have an official translation until I think the PSP version came out. Bahamut's Lagoon, which still doesn't have an official English translation, but is a crazy amazing game. Final Fantasy V was another one that I found through a fan translation before I found it through. They eventually released 5 and 6 as Final Fantasy Anthology on the PS1. And yeah, Final Fantasy V is amazing. And then I learned about Final Fantasy 3, which we never got over here until it got re-released on, I think the 3D remake on the DS was the first time we got to play Final Fantasy 3. So yeah, and then after getting that, Legend of Mana came out in the PS1. I loved that game, even though it's kind of a black sheep in the Mana family because it's very non-linear and weird, and you have to build the world, and if you build it incorrectly, you can't do certain things because each new area is locked behind an artifact, and you have to place the artifacts on a map. And depending on where you place them, it changes how the other artifacts next to it work. And there's certain artifacts that have to be placed in next to water or in water and stuff. And so there are literal guides online that have existed since it came out on PS1, and they were all hosted on GameFAQs, that basically teach you how to build the world correctly so you can actually experience the entire story. And it's very, very easy to effectively lock yourself out of certain storylines and things like that. But yeah, overall, the Mana series in and of itself is absolutely phenomenal. Going back to the idea of what this channel is mostly focused on, which is tabletop RPGs, I have been really heavily fixating on the idea of how to run a Mana series tabletop RPG. Because I love this series so much, and I love the various worlds that they've created. I can't remember if I did this for Daily December or not. I could look, but that would require work. For Daily December, one of the things that I did was I did this the thing where I would give tips on how to make a tabletop RPG out of like a popular video game franchise. And now one of the ones I definitely did was Legend of Dragoon, which I think I talked about using Fabula Ultima to replicate Legend of Dragoon, which was cool and interesting and fun. But I wanted to do one for Trials of Mana, and I can't remember if I actually did it, but my idea was using D&D 4th edition for it, because one of the more interesting aspects of Trials of Mana is, unlike literally every other Mana series game where you get your protagonist, and then generally you will have at least one other party member. Sometimes they'll be temporary, like in Final Fantasy Adventure or Sword of Mana, which was the remake. You would just have party members that would kind of rotate through. Or in Secret of Mana, they were permanent. You got Popoi, who was the sprite, and then I can't remember what the girl's name is. But you had the Randy, who was the main character. You had Popoi, who was the sprite, and then the girl that I can't remember her name. And they were just your party for the entire game. And then Legend of Mana, you would get you actually could technically have two party members. One would be like a guest NPC, and the other one would either be a monster that you raise, because it's a cool monster raising thing, or a golem that you built. Both of which were super cool and fun. For Trials of Mana, instead of having a static 3-person party, there were 6 characters that you could choose from in the beginning, and the first one would be your main character that you chose, and then the other 2 would just be side characters. And so Trials of Mana had this really cool thing where you could replay it, and technically there were 3 different endings depending on who you chose as your main character. Because there were basically 3 pairs of main characters that had the same effective storyline. Or not the same storyline, but had linked storylines, and would fight the same end boss. So the other thing that makes Trials of Mana so unique was what they called the class change system, which is basically all of the characters would start as a base class. Then when you got to level 18, you could choose to change classes, and you got a choice between a light class and a dark class, and they each focused on different things. Like for Duran, who is the swordsman, his first choice is between a knight and I can't remember what the other one was focused on. But the knight, if you went down, and that was the light choice, the knight path would give you healing abilities and turn you a little bit closer to kind of like a paladin style character. Whereas the dark path would give you magic that allowed you to effectively cast elemental sabers and stuff on your weapon and other people's weapons, which is really good combat wise, because elemental weaknesses are a massive thing in the Mana series in general. And then at level, I think it was 36 or 38, you got another class change, which you could also choose light or dark. So in the base game, you could end up as one of 4 different classes at the very end. With like the light choice for Duran being Paladin, and the light dark choice for Duran being what's called Liege, which instead of the light choice would just give you more kind of protection defensive stuff. The light dark would be a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more combat, but still very defensive focused. On the other side, I can't remember what they were. So anyway, the reason I chose 4th edition is they already have effectively a quote-unquote class change system built into it with Paragon paths and Epic Destinies. Basically, when you reach level 11, you choose your Paragon path, which is effectively kind of like a subclass, but it's not exclusively limited to your class. Like in 5th edition, when you get to 3rd level, you choose your subclass for most classes. There's a few that get it at 2nd level, or there's one that gets it at 2nd level, the druid, and then there's a couple that get it at 1st level, the cleric and the sorcerer. But these subclasses are linked exclusively to each class. Like, you can't be a blade singing barbarian, because blade singer is a wizard, so it's a subclass. Paragon paths and Epic Destiny were a little bit different. The Paragon path was linked to some aspect of your character. The possible Paragon paths you could choose was linked to some aspect of your character. Like, there were some that required you to be a certain race, because they would tie into the lore of the race. There were some that were would require you to be a certain class. So there were, sword mage Paragon paths, and there were even some Paragon paths that required you to choose certain abilities as you leveled up, like the Assault Sword Mage, or the things like that. In addition to that, there were just kind of generic ones, like there were alignment based ones. There were just overall martial based ones. There were ones that were tied to your power source, because there were a bunch of different power sources in the D&D 5th edition. You had martial, arcane, primal, which is basically all the nature stuff. So rangers were primal, druids were primal, stuff like that. You had psionic, which is where monks came from. Then there was also shadow. And so the Paragon path system, I think, was one of the best kind of subclass systems in that D&D has ever had, because again, the thing that I think 4th edition did better than any other version of D&D is you could create very unique, distinct characters to the point where you could have an entire party that were basically the same class that played nothing alike. And in 5th edition, you can kind of do that a little bit. Like, you could have a bunch of wizards, and if they all take a different subclass and use different feats, or if you bring multi-classing into it, you can create some relatively interesting characters. But they're still going to be wizards. They're still all going to play relatively similarly, where they're mostly going to cast spells. They're going to have access to the same spell list for the most part. Really, the only thing that's going to change is what they're best at. But in 4th edition, again, you could have an entire team of fighters. It wouldn't be a great team. I'm going to put this down right now, because healing was actually useful in 4th edition, so you really did need to have a healer on the party, and fighters can't be healers. But if you really wanted to have kind of a martial-based healer, you could choose a warlord and still have effectively an entire team of fighters. But even if you just chose everybody was just the same actual starting class, because of all the different powers you can choose, and then once you deal with Paragon Paths and Epic Destinies, all of them would play very, very differently. They would use different weapons. They would have different attacks. They could very possibly use different armor. Like, it was really, really cool. And so the reason I thought Legend of Mana would work so well in 4th edition, and again, I can't remember if I made this video or not. I remember planning it out. I just don't remember if I ever actually made it. So if I'm repeating myself, it's because my brain is just a Swiss cheese. But the reason I thought it would work really, really well is in Trials of Mana, when you change classes, lots of stuff changes. Again, if we just look at Duran, you go from the base fighter version or swordmaster, whatever, swordsman class for Duran. He's useful in the original 2D version. He was useful because his sword swings were really wide, so you could generally hit multiple monsters at the same time with it. But that was really all he did, was he attacked and that was it. If you went the light path, he now could become your team healer. And he quite literally could carry the team as far as healing was concerned without too much difficulty. And once he went up to his next class, he would get a multi-target heal, and he was really, really good at keeping the team alive. Whereas if you went the dark path, he now became a damaging powerhouse because of how useful elemental damage is, and the fact that each elemental blade could inflict a status on regular creatures. Generally didn't work on bosses, but like an ice blade, if you infected your blade with ice magic, effectively you could freeze enemies, which in Trials of Mana meant you would turn them into snowmen, which is hilarious. Or fire blades could engulf them and they'd be on fire for a little bit. So yeah, it massively changed how the class played. And when you take your Paragon path, it massively changes how the class plays. And if you want to reinforce how you already play it, you look for a Paragon path that fits that. And if you want to just massively, give yourself new abilities in that, you choose a very different Paragon path. The same thing was true about Epic Destinies. So I always thought it would be really fun to run a Mana series, like short mini campaign using 4th edition, because I think it'd be massively fun. So whether or not that ever becomes the thing that I do, I love 4th edition D&D. It really is a lot of fun. And a lot of the people that think that it was this backwards, like everybody hated it, it didn't. It outsold every single 3rd edition and 3.5 book in like 6 to 9 months. So it was massively popular. It wasn't as popular as Wizards of the Coast wanted it to be, but it was still massively popular. People loved it. One of my favorite things in the world When Acquisitions Incorporated was switching over from 4th edition to D&D Next, for one of their live games, because this was back when the playtest was going on. And Acquisitions Incorporated has always been a marketing tool for Wizards of the Coast. Like, the reason the original podcast got started was they wanted to find a way to get people interested in D&D 4th edition, and so they contacted, I think it was Jerry Holkins. They contacted and said, hey, do you guys want, we'll send Chris Perkins over, he'll help you build characters, and then he'll run you through an adventure in D&D. And Mike Krahulik had never played D&D before, and I can't remember if Scott Kurtz had played or not, but they made their kick of characters, and you can, like, the podcast still exists. You can still listen to it today, and they're all really, really good. So they made their characters, and then they did, I think it was Keep on the Borderlands was the adventure, because I think that was one of the adventures that they updated to 4th edition. And so, again, it was a marketing tool. And then they kept going, and they started doing more kind of custom stuff, and it started getting sillier and sillier, especially when they started doing the live shows. And so they did 2 live shows using D&D 4th edition. They had one where they had to go and save Will Wheaton's character Aophel from hell. So they had, I think it's called like the Adventures of Slaughterfast or somewhere, because that's where they had to go, is this place called Slaughterfast. And then the next one was called The Last Will and Testament of Jim Dark Magic the First, which is basically they went to Jim's home in New Hampshire, and it was basically a reading of the will for his late grandfather. And they're both hilarious. But the very next adventure, they decided to do D&D Next because the playtest itself had been ramping up and they wanted to advertise it. And so what was happening was Chris was helping them kind of transform their character. We'll try this one more at a time. Transform their characters from 4th edition characters, which I believe after, or for the Last Will and Testament of Jim Dark Magic, I believe they were either level 5 or like level 7 or 8, somewhere in there. So they were still in the kind of adventure tier of play, which for comparison to 5th edition, the adventure tier kind of encapsulated both tier 1 and tier 2 of 5th edition D&D. Paragon tier is similar to tier 3, and then Epic tier was effectively tier 4. So they were effectively pretty squarely in tier 2 is what we would understand it from 5th edition. So they were decently powerful characters, and in 4th edition everything was just bigger. So even first level characters, a first level 4th edition character could wipe the floor with a first level 5th edition character. They were just, everything was bigger. So he's helping, Mike and Jerry and Scott and Will transfer their characters over and turn them into 5th edition characters. And as he was going over, as he was working with Mike, Mike just was looking at the fact that in 4th edition he could summon a lava creature and he could do all these really amazing, cool abilities. And in his 5th edition character, he had next to nothing. Like, he had an extra dimensional hole and he could cast magic missile, but it was limited. Like, he only had a few magic missile spells he could cast per day, whereas in 4th edition, magic missile was a cantrip, so you could just do it and it just did damage. It was great. So he turned to Chris, and Chris tells this story in some interview. So he turned to Chris and he goes, "Why in the hell would I ever want to go from 4th edition, where I'm super cool and have been super cool since level 1, to 5th edition, where I'm just kind of a loser that can barely do anything?" And Chris was completely taken aback, because the kind of prevailing conversation on the internet, which we find out much later was a very small minority of people that just really, really liked third edition and were upset that third edition only lasted 8 years. The prevailing kind of conversation on the internet and what he was exposed to was fourth edition is the worst edition that has ever existed, and everyone that made it deserves to die. And like they were vicious about it. They were absolutely horrible about it, and it kind of blew his mind that he was, of everything he was suspecting to hear, one of them was not, why in the hell would I ever want to go from 4th edition to 5th edition? Because it was in his head that everyone hated 4th edition and would do anything they possibly could to get away from it. And it was a really kind of sobering moment, because Chris Burgess has talked about the idea that 4th edition left a really bad taste in his mouth. Not because he didn't like it, for the exact opposite reason. He was extremely proud of 4th edition. He thought it was a really, really great thing. And the reaction by the fan base, which again was a very tiny minority, but a very, very loud minority, was so negative. Like, he'd never seen this kind of a reaction. And they had done a similar massive change to how Dungeons and Dragons works. Between basically every edition of D&D, it makes pretty massive changes. When we go from basic D&D to advanced Dungeons and Dragons, there were pretty massive changes, to the point where basic D&D continued going on all the way through most of advanced D&D 2nd edition. Basic D&D still existed. When you went from 1st edition D&D to 2nd edition D&D, massive changes. Like, you stopped rolling on tables. They introduced THACO. They introduced weapon proficiencies and things like that. Like, it was a pretty big change. And then going from 2nd edition to 3rd edition, the change was so massive that it was really one of the first times where people didn't just automatically upgrade. Like, if you were playing basic D&D, they released kind of supplemental versions of basic D&D that just got more and more complex, but people generally just went with it. If you were playing the advanced D&D line, you generally went from advanced Dungeons and Dragons to 2nd edition advanced Dungeons and Dragons. There really wasn't a whole lot of conversation. When 3rd edition appeared, this is the first time when people were like, you know what, I'm going to stick with my 2nd edition. I like my 2nd edition. They weren't nasty about it. Like, they weren't saying, oh, this is the worst edition. They just went, I don't like this. I like 2nd edition better. Because 3rd edition was a massive, massive change to how Dungeons and Dragons worked. The armor class system was completely reevaluated. The skill system was completely reevaluated. Multi-classing was completely redone. They introduced a brand new system called prestige classes, which are classes that you couldn't take until after you had taken a bunch of levels in other classes. The feat system was a massive, massive change. And so it turned off, not a lot, but it turned off enough of a portion of the fan base that there was still people playing 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons. And there's still people to this day that play 2nd edition D&D and 1st edition D&D and basic D&D. And there's the whole old school, the OSR movement, which is basically creating games that work very similarly to the basic version of D&D or advanced D&D. But when 3rd edition went to 4th edition, again, it was a very, very massive change, which is what happens every time we have a new edition of D&D. That's why they don't call them, like, 3 to 3.5 was a very, very minor change. In the idea that most of the mechanics didn't change, they just got modified to work better. A lot of the stuff that changed from 3 to 3.5 is mostly quality of life stuff that players a lot of the time had already been doing as homebrew rules, and Wizards of the Coast just kind of collected a lot of those and came up with a few of their own. It just made the game run a little bit smoother and a little bit easier. So, 3rd edition, 4th edition, 5th edition, 6th edition, 7th edition, 8th edition, 9th edition, 10th edition, 11th edition, 12th edition, 13th edition, 14th edition, 15th edition, 16th edition, 17th edition, 18th edition, 19th edition, 20th edition, 21st edition, 22nd edition, 23rd edition, 24th edition, 25th edition, 26th edition, 27th edition, 28th edition, 29th edition, 30th edition, 31st edition, 32nd edition, 33rd edition, 34th edition, 35th edition, 36th edition, 37th edition, 38th edition, 39th edition, 40th edition, 41st edition, 42nd edition, 43rd edition, 44th edition, 45th edition, 46th edition, 47th edition, 48th edition, 49th edition, 50th edition, 51st edition, 52nd edition, 53rd edition, 54th edition, 55th going from third edition to fourth edition again was a massive, massive change. Very similar to second edition to third edition, but the internet was a much bigger place at that point. Again, fourth edition launched in 2008, whereas third edition launched in the year 2000. In the year 2000, the internet was mostly used for chat rooms and AOL Instant Messenger. But they didn't have like they had forums and stuff like that, but they weren't quite as widespread. And there weren't things like Twitter, but D&D launched, and Facebook was already a big thing. YouTube was getting its feet underneath it, and but by the time the quote unquote backlash started, where everybody hated D&D 4th edition, because again it was massively popular when it first launched. But by the time it started to become everybody hates D&D, Twitter was a thing. D&D 4th edition didn't end until 2014. So the internet and social media in general had gone through quite a few different iterations. MySpace had come and gone. Facebook was actually popular and used by people under the age of 60 at that point. So yeah, it turned into this really, really negative, toxic thing about 4th edition. This rumor spread that everybody hated 4th edition, and that 4th edition was the reason that Pathfinder was the number one RPG in the world for a little bit. By the way, it never was. That's a lie, basically perpetuated by Paizo themselves, because for 9 months after D&D had stopped publishing books, according to a single really flawed survey, more Pathfinder books were being sold than D&D books, because again, D&D wasn't selling any books, so they were competing with no one for 9 months. And then 5th edition launched, and they went back to their distant second place very, very quickly. But yeah, so going back to the whole Mike Rulick thing, he was, and Chris Perkins things. Chris Perkins was kind of blown away by the idea that someone actually liked 4th edition D&D. And there was actually a lot more than just Acquisitions Incorporated that used 4th edition. There was, can't remember who it was. It might have been the Robot Chicken guys. I can't remember. It was one kind of group of creators had Chris Perkins come in and run a 4th edition adventure for them, and none of, or most of them had not played. I don't know if it was none. And there was a celebrity game at Gen Con where who was it? Ed Greenwood, Ari Salvatore, and a couple other people sat down and played D&D for an audience. They actually got one person from the audience to play with them. So some random dude at Gen Con got to sit down at a table with Chris Perkins as the DM, sitting with Ed Greenwood and R.A. Salvatore and a bunch of just really, really famous D&D people got to sit down at a table and play. That still exists on the internet. I believe it's on I believe it's on YouTube somewhere. If you look for Gen Con celebrity game or something like that, you might have to put 4E in there. You can find it. One of my favorite things in the world was, I think it was Ed Greenwood. If you don't know the name, Ed Greenwood created the Forgotten Realms. So the default setting for 5th edition, yeah, Ed Greenwood made that up in the 80s. And he's also an author. He writes all the Elminster books. If you played Baldur's Gate 3, Elminster has a presence in that game. He's also in Baldur's Gate 1. I can't remember if he shows up in 2. Basically, most Forgotten Realms games, Elminster will show up, and that's effectively Ed Greenwood's self-insert character. So anyway, Ed Greenwood was playing, I think he was playing a rogue. And basically what happened for this game was Chris Perkins had these pre-built characters. And that was one of the nice things about 4th edition, is when you built the character with their character builder. I've shown you guys before when I built 4th edition characters. Part of the thing using their character builder was to print out a bunch of cards with all of your different powers on them. And so giving someone a pre-made 4th edition character was actually a lot of fun, because you would give them a couple pages because your character sheet was generally at least 3 pages long. Because you'd have your actual character sheet with your feats and everything listed on and all your different stats. And then you would have a background sheet that nobody ever used. Then the third page would be all of your power cards. And so that was actually a lot of fun. So what Chris Perkins had done is he just brought a bunch of pre-built 4th edition characters. And so when they started the game, he just kind of handed them out to all the players. These authors had never seen these characters before. They had no idea who they were. When the dude got pulled up out of the audience, if I remember correctly, Chris Perkins kind of asks him, okay, so what do you want to play? I've got, these classes. And the guy goes, Warlock. He goes, okay. And then the only other question I have to ask you is, do you want Infernal Pact or Fey Pact? And I can't remember if he chose Infernal or Fey. It's a great episode. But what happens is, because all of these other people, they're writers, like they're creatives, just getting their characters, they just started making shit up. For the characters didn't have any backstories. They were just stat blocks. And so they just started making shit up. And if I remember correctly, Ed Boon's character was a rogue that he decided attacked exclusively with spoons. And he had a dent in his head that he stored butter in. This is the genius of Ed Greenwood. And so it very, very quickly turned into absolute nonsense and chaos. As Ed would go around is like, beware my spoon. Would you like some butter? And Ed Greenwood is one of my favorite people in the world because he is a genuinely nice person. He is very charismatic, and he's a bass. He has this extremely low, not really booming, but just very resonant voice. And he always has a little smile. And he has this really big, thick beard. But you can always see it in his eyes that he's almost always smiling. And he's just a really, really great guy. I had the chance to meet him once, I think at Gen Con. And he, by far, one of the most delightful people I've ever had the chance to talk with. I also got to meet Scott Kurtz, who's a nice enough guy. But he's kind of a jackass when he wants to be. And I got to meet Chris Perkins, which is where I became friends with Chris Perkins. And what I mean by that is I came up to Chris Perkins at a D&D event where he was just mingling around. I go, I'm sorry, are you Chris Perkins? He goes, yeah. I said, I love Acquisitions Incorporated. It's the reason I started playing Dungeons & Dragons. He goes, oh, we love hearing that. And I had a copy of the first adventure I had written. It was a parody campaign called D&D High. And I said, I'm really sorry to ask this, but this is my parody campaign that I wrote. Would you be willing to sign it for me? Because I'd actually gotten it printed and bound and had really nice covers on it. And he goes, yeah, sure, I'd love to. So he signed it. I have his signature and I have Scott Kurtz's signature. And eventually, before the agoraphobia happened, I wanted to see if I could get Mike and Jerry's signature on it. At one point, I wanted Will Wheaton's signature on it, but that ship has sailed. And then just everyone else that's played in Acquisitions Incorporated. Patrick Rothfuss, who Patrick Rothfuss might actually happen someday because he lives in Wisconsin. So, like, if I can ever leave my house, he is the most likely for me to randomly meet one day. Or Holly Conrad, because she, her character Strix shows up a ton, or Anna Prosser. So yeah, I eventually wanted to get all of their signatures. It never happened. But anyway, so in that conversation, he did that, and we were just kind of shooting the shit, and somebody from Paizo comes over, and Chris Perkins goes, hey, and he greets this person because this person used to work for Wizards of the Coast, used to work with Chris Perkins. He defected. No, he just went over to Paizo. Which, fun fact, before the whole OGL debacle, the majority of people that worked at Paizo had no problem with Wizards of the Coast. Like, half of them used to work for Wizards of the Coast. So the idea that Paizo has been in this bitter rivalry with Wizards of the Coast was never really a thing. There was just a few people in the higher-ups at Wizards of the Coast that got too big for their britches and wanted to claim that they were in this endless battle with Wizards of the Coast, which they were never going to win. But so this dude comes over, and Chris goes, hey, how are you doing? He says, and I'm doing my best to just keep quiet, and I was about ready to kind of extricate myself from the conversation. I'm like, well, your friend is here. I'm not gonna waste your time. And without prompting or anything, Chris Perkins turns to me and then turns back to us and goes, "Have you met my friend Jody?" And this guy from Paizo goes, "No, I was so. Do you know what Paizo is?" I very much know what Paizo is. You guys make Pathfinder and everything. I said, "Yeah." I said, "Yeah, it's a pleasure to meet you." Well, I mean, obviously you guys have stuff to talk about, so I'm going to go. But thank you very much, Chris, for signing and being a wonderful person. But I am friends with Chris Perkins. Yeah. No. I've interacted with Chris a few times. I used to help out with GameholeCon, which is a big gaming convention in Madison, and while Wizards of the Coast comes down for GameholeCon, I believe every year, and so I got to meet and converse with Chris Perkins a few times. I almost got to play at his table. 1 year at GameholeCon, because that's one of the things that Chris used to do. I don't know if he still does it, but every year at GameholeCon he would run like 2 or 3 games where you would get DM'd by Chris Perkins. And I've had a couple friends that have actually gotten to sit at his table, and he's just as wonderful and magical in person as he is on stage. Like, he's just an amazingly cool dude. And so yeah, that's my story. So getting back to the Mana series, Visions of Mana is coming out, I think, this spring-ish. I can't remember, but I'm super excited about that. I hope it's a good game. I hope they actually take a few lessons from the Trials of Mana remake, where in the Trials of Mana remake you would get skill points that you could invest in, like 5, I think it was 5 different skills, and depending on how many points you spent in each skill, you would get these little passive abilities and active abilities, and that was really fun and cool. So I hope they have a system like that, and they all the different skills were associated with generally 1 or 2 of the mana spirits, or one of the elemental spirits. So it was really cool. So I hope they do something like that for Visions of Mana, where they allow you to kind of build your character. I'm upset that it looks like it's a single character and not a team, but whatever. I love the Mana series. I love Final Fantasy, and that's what I've been doing. I've got a game to run in like 7 minutes, so I gotta get going. But hope you guys enjoyed me just rambling about stuff that I like. As far as yesterday's topic, I have heard from you all, and yeah, things are in the works. Let's put it that way. Otherwise, that's going to be all for me today. And I will see you guys in the next time. All right? Bye-bye.